Like the office they commemorate, presidential libraries are living institutions. Certainly it is my hope that the Reagan Library will become a dynamic intellectual forum where scholars interpret the past and policymakers debate the future.
Welcome to A Reagan Forum, hosted by the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. The Center for Public Affairs offers lectures and forums presenting perspectives on important public policy issues of the day from politicians, authors, members of the media, business and military leaders, and more. On August 7, 2024, the Reagan Foundation hosted a virtual event with award-winning historian, biographer, and curator Heath Hardage Lee for a discussion on her latest book, The Mysterious Mrs. Nixon, The Life and Times of Washington's Most Private First Lady. In The Mysterious Mrs. Nixon, Heath Hardage Lee presents readers with the essential nature of Mrs. Nixon, an empathetic, adventurous, self-made woman who wanted no power or influence, but who connected warmly with both ordinary Americans and people from different cultures she encountered worldwide. During the program, Heath sat down in conversation with Reagan Foundation and Institute Chief Marketing Officer Melissa Giller to discuss Mrs. Nixon's childhood, her life in the public eye, and her legacy. Let's listen. Thank you all for joining us so much. We have Heath Hardage Lee with us today for her book. Now, I am holding a galley copy of the book, and we're selling the hard copy, The Mysterious Mrs. Nixon, The Life and Times of Washington's Most Private First Lady. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. I'm going to start with a couple of really easy questions. Now, the first question I actually think you sort of address in the acknowledgement section, not the epilogue. I think it was the acknowledgement section. But for those people who are watching this who may not have read the book yet, why did you choose Pat Nixon for your book project?
Yes, well, this is my third book, and often one book leads to another. My previous book, The League of Wives, was about POW and MIA wives during the Vietnam era. So I had spent a lot of time at the Nixon library working on that book. So when I was there at the library working on that book, I, of course, kept running across pictures of Mrs. Nixon. And I have one really great picture that I actually have framed in my office of Mrs. Nixon with a number of the POW wives that I name in the book at a tea when their husbands were still imprisoned and the Nixons were trying to help bring them home. So it was interesting to have that intersection between my subjects. And I also thought after I did the POW Wives book, I know women like Mrs. Nixon. I know who she is. And when I saw her in all these wonderful pictures at the library being so active and out and about, I thought, well, one, I know this person. I know this, that generation of women well from my last book. And I also thought all the pictures and items I saw at the Nixon Library with Mrs. Nixon were so active, so outward facing. And that was such a contrast to some of the media of the time, calling her plastic Pat, saying she was Sphinx-like and mysterious. So I figured that might not be exactly the truth. And that's really what pulled me in to do the research.
And that actually was the perfect tee up for my next question for you. In reading your book, she did so many incredible things, and we will get to all of those incredible things. And it made me, sort of, why the word mysterious in the title?
Yes, well, Mrs. Nixon, to a lot of people, when I first started working on the book, I became very aware that people found her mysterious. They would not know much about her at all, or they would get her mixed up, or they would say things about her that were not true, or there was no evidence for that. But there wasn't a lot on the record about Mrs. Nixon speaking about herself, what she thought. She was very, very careful about that because she believed she was not the elected official. She shouldn't be speaking out of term, particularly on policy issues very often. So it took a little bit of digging. She was also very humble and very much not a fan of the spotlight. She did not like that. She did not want to be in the spotlight. Her press secretaries had to push her to take more credit for all the amazing things she was doing. She was out and about doing a lot, but she did not want to praise herself. That was just anathema to her. And I think sometimes to her detriment, she didn't take credit for a lot of the things that she did. So this all contributes to this idea that she was mysterious and was holding things back. So that again was just intriguing to me. It was sort of wanting to do a little forensic digging about who was she and what did she really think about things.
Got it. And so, this is just a little, I guess, fun, lighthearted question, but, we all know president and first lady's names, right? So, Ronald and Nancy Reagan, or Barack and Michelle Obama, and Richard and Pat Nixon, but her name wasn't Pat. Her name was Thelma, I believe, right? So can you tell everyone how she got the name Pat, where that came from?
Yes, well, yes, she had the name Thelma Catherine Ryan. She was known as Buddy for a long time as a child. That was her nickname. And she, eventually when she went off, finally decided later down the road to go off to college, she wanted to be Pat or Patricia. That I think she felt that was sort of part of almost a new identity. And her father, Will Ryan, really did not like the name Thelma that her mother had given her. And so he called her Buddy, but he, also liked Pat and Patricia, and she wanted to honor him by really taking that name. And in the book, I talk about how it's a bit of, I see it a bit as her grown-up name. She kind of outgrows those other personas and other nicknames and really becomes Pat or Patricia. And that's how her future husband, Dick Nixon, meets her, and really that's how we all know her as Americans, is by Pat or Patricia.
Now, a second ago, you mentioned her mother. If I recall correctly, she was only 13 when her mother passed away. How did that sort of shape and define her life as she grew up?
Oh, yes. I mean, Mrs. Nixon had a really hard life. It is like a Depression era film. It's like Hollywood could not make up anything more bleak than her upbringing. So her mother does die when she's 13 of Bright's disease, and she really becomes the de facto head of the household in terms of being the domestic head of the household. She is cleaning, she is cooking, she is ironing her two brothers' shirts. She is also going to school the whole time, and later working multiple jobs while taking care of not only her brothers, but then her father, who becomes very ill with silicosis. He was a miner in his earlier days, and then he dies when she is 17. So she's effectively orphaned by the time she's 17. And she has some, interesting quotes where she says, life was sort of sad, and my job was to stay cheerful and keep everybody's spirits up. So this starts very early in her life. And as we see later, this is a great resource for her to fall back on. She doesn't always expect a lot from life, but she strives for things to be better and to make people around her happy, sometimes to her own detriment. I think I often want her to just take a break. When I was researching, I kept saying, gosh, please, Pat, just take a nap. It's just, she just worked so hard, and I think put so much pressure on herself to take care of everybody else that, she's not always taking care of herself, which is true of women in all ages, I think, but particularly in her era.
Yeah. So she grows up, she's in her 20s. She meets a young Richard Nixon. You've got some great, I did not know any of those stories about how hard he pursued her and how he would drive her on her other dates. I mean, I thought that was so funny.
I love that.
But I guess really getting back to the point you just made, that she's a people pleaser. You write in your book that it was clear that Richard Nixon had a realization that he was made, public service was his life, and that perhaps Mrs. Nixon would have preferred he not run. But she's a pleaser and she wants to support people, so she supports him. How did she come to terms with his political ambition?
Oh, I think this was a hard one. At first, when he first gets into politics, which this would be in 1946, when he wins that first congressional election for the House of Representatives against Voorhees, she is all in. She has used part of her inheritance, her small inheritance, to fund the campaign, to pay for campaign literature, which is, quickly a bunch of it is essentially stolen by opponents. And she sees very early kind of all the dirty tricks that go on during campaigns on all sides. And she is all in at first, and for the first couple of elections in 1950, the Senate election, then on to the vice presidency. But I would say when she gets to 1952, this is when Eisenhower is considering Richard Nixon for his running mate to be vice president. There is an accusation of a slush fund that Richard Nixon has. This turns out to be false, but he has to go on television with Pat and talk about all their finances, lay bare their entire financial existence, which is horribly embarrassing and traumatic for Pat. And I think after that point, she is very wary of politics. That turns out, and he does go on to be Eisenhower's vice president, but she sees how difficult it is, and the rumors and the mudslinging, and it just gets progressively more unpleasant for her. But as you noted quite correctly, she is a people pleaser, and she wants to do what is going to make her husband happy. And she knows early on in their relationship, even before they're married, that his ambitions are in politics. She's aware, but not aware until she really gets into it, what a muckraking situation this can be at times.
Yeah. Now, you talked about it a little bit just now, but you also talked about it a little bit in the beginning when you talked about Plastic Pat and the mysterious Pat. Mrs. Reagan was horribly made fun of by the media when she first became First Lady until she was able to win them over. How was Mrs. Nixon able to win the media over?
Yes, well, and yes, Mrs. Reagan, I think all First Ladies, I've recently written an op-ed about this. Mrs. Nixon said it was the hardest unpaid job in the world. And I would have to agree. And I think you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. It's not really a very well set out role. Each person shapes it differently. But I think Mrs. Nixon, as you'll recall, had been in politics for so long, since 1946, had been second lady for 8 years. And I say in my book, I think she was perhaps the best prepared person, the best prepared second lady at that point to be first lady. She had had so much training, and she had won over a lot of people during that time as second lady. She had traveled all over the world on diplomatic missions where President Eisenhower had told her husband, take Pat with you. She was extremely popular. So she went in on a very popular wave. And when she, of course, finally becomes the first lady, this is not until 1968. She and her husband lose to Jack Kennedy in 1960. And what's interesting, in 1960, she's really far more popular than Jackie Kennedy is on the campaign trail. Everyone wants Pat for first lady, but they get Jackie. And then Jackie is also horribly, gone after on the campaign trail. And she only becomes popular once she is first lady. So Pat has this long in between of about 8 years. And then President Nixon, Richard Nixon becomes President Nixon in 68. And I think it takes her a little bit to get mentally to be jumping in with full feet because of all the traumas of the past, particularly the 1960 election, which she always thought that election was stolen from them and said so. So it takes her not long, but just a little bit to kind of reset, to orient, and to see what she wants to do. All the media people, there are a lot of media people in the West Wing, a lot of people from Madison Avenue, and they were really pushing her to do a signature project. And she did not like that. This is where her Western DNA comes in. She hates hierarchy. She does not like people telling her what to do. She is an old, experienced political hand. A lot of these West Wing guys are young men. They're advertising people. They're not political people. And she pushes back and is like, I need a minute to figure out what I want to do. And instead of one project, she says, people are my project. And that allows her to do, most people think of Mrs. Nixon and volunteerism, but that is just one piece of her people project. And there's so many different things we can talk about more today. There are outward facing agendas, and there's also a lot of inside pushing from the inside agendas that I really focus on in the book, that I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit.
Yeah, I mean, literally, it's like you know what my next question is going to be, because my next question was going to be talking about outward and inward. Her belief, her fight, her stance for women's equality, and what she pushed through outwardly, but then even inwardly. I think I read in your book, because of Mrs. Nixon, we had the first female White House aides. Before that, they'd only been men. And just, really making inroads on everything she was doing. Can you talk about that really important piece of her legacy?
Oh, absolutely. And that one about the White House military social aides is a good one to start with, because I see postings all the time that are incorrect about that. So Mrs. Nixon, a lot of people think it was Betty Ford, but it was Mrs. Nixon that instituted the first female social aides. And I interviewed Chris Holliday, who was one of the first batch of these women. And this came about because there was a woman at one of the White House dinners that was having trouble, and there were only male social military aides back even in the late 60s. And Mrs. Nixon said, well, why don't we have female military social aides? So within a year, that was in play. That's a huge thing that people miss or misattribute. So that's a great one to start with. And that is just one of so many things. Very progressive on her views about women. She was not a feminist, however. So that's an important distinction. Feminism in the late 60s, early 70s is kind of associated with the radical left, with communism. It's sort of seen as a fringe thing. Now we see it completely differently, but that word at that time was not seen always as a positive by certain segments of the political population, particularly the Republican Party. So she would say and I say in the book, she is pro-women. Women can do anything if they are qualified, if they are educated. She was pro-ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, pro-choice, which was remarkable. She was the first lady to use the word abortion in public, and to say a woman should have the choice to do whatever she wants. So ahead of her time, and perhaps ahead of ours now as well. So very interesting on that. And then one big thing in the book, this is just a huge thing I uncovered that people had forgotten or never really realized, is Mrs. Nixon, and this has been written about, had pushed hard for women on the Supreme Court. This is one of her public things that she does. She says, we need to have women on the court. We need to have some balance there with gender and get women on the court. It is long overdue. And when it doesn't happen, she really gets pretty upset with her husband. And her daughter Julie talks about that in an oral history at the dinner table. They have quite a discussion, very civil, but she's very displeased that this has not happened. Now, people like to blame Richard Nixon for that, but that was the ABA, that was the American Bar Association, which at the time did not want any women. So Mildred Lilly was the appointee whose name was also leaked, and that did not happen. The other piece that I uncovered that I thought was fascinating was that Richard Nixon, with the support of Pat in the background, had really considered a Black woman in 1969 for the Supreme Court, a woman named Jewel LaFontaine. He had considered her and another Black woman as potential appointees for the Supreme Court, or candidates he was going to put forward for the Supreme Court. And then that also didn't happen. I mean, the ABA, there was no way they were going to let women of any color at that point, in my reading, be Supreme Court picks. But behind the scenes, Pat is pushing for this. She and Richard Nixon are very progressive on their views of women. And at the time, minorities also. So that was just fascinating to me, but not surprising to me, given both of their backgrounds. They both went to school with a real mix of people, different races, different religions. California was just a big, mixing bowl at that point, as it still is. And so it was not segregated like the East Coast. So I think they came in with very different ideas than some of their East Coast counterparts about women and about minorities. And I found that fascinating.
Now, you may not have run across this in your research, but any chance you found anything on her thoughts when Ronald Reagan nominated Sandra Day O'Connor and then she was appointed as the first woman to be on the Supreme Court?
Oh gosh, I wish I had found that.
Yeah.
I did actually look for that, and I did not. I can give you a little background though about Sandra Day O'Connor. I did not find, Mrs. Nixon at that point had withdrawn from public life and was really not commenting publicly. Now, I can speculate that she was cheering in the background. I bet that she was. And what's so interesting is Sandra Day O'Connor was found during the Nixon administration by an amazing woman, Barbara Hackman Franklin, who was the president's special assistant in 1971 onwards. And her task with Mrs. Nixon's push behind the scenes was to get more women in government. She had something called a talent bank for different areas, including the Supreme Court. And Barbara was the one that identified Sandra Day O'Connor. So, it took 10 more years, but the seeds were planted during the Nixon administration, and then they blossomed during the Reagan administration, which is just amazing. So it all worked. It just took a little time.
Sure. Now, I felt that the theme of your book really was Mrs. Nixon's grace under pressure. Where do you think that stemmed from?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, she is the ultimate grace under pressure. Keep calm and carry on. I mean, those are the things I think of when I think about her. I think it stems from first her childhood, the difficult childhood we talked about, where it is just so bleak. You just have to keep your chin up and, look for the everyday good things that happen, the positive things that happen, and try to be kind to other people, uplift other people, all things that are sort of difficult sometimes in the political world. She's such a great model for that. Then as they go along, of course, Richard Nixon and Pat Nixon's life together is one drama after another. For a biographer, it's never a dull moment for the biographer or the reader, because there are so many ups and downs, so many obstacles. And one of the defining grace under pressure moments, I think, there's so many, but one is the fund crisis, which I mentioned, also known as the Checkers speech, where the Nixons are filmed on television. Richard Nixon is laying all his finances and Pat's finances bare. Very embarrassing for her, but he insists she be on television with him, right next to him. And he tells her right before, I can't do this, Pat. And she holds his hand and says, yes, you can. You must do this. So, there's a galvanizing moment. And then later, another one I think of a lot for grace under pressure would be Caracas in 1958. There is a communist mob that tries to basically assassinate Richard Nixon, his entourage all around him. They are all in danger. The mob has guns, they're throwing rocks, they're clubbing things, they break the windshield of his car, they rock the cars and try to turn them over. Mrs. Nixon, meanwhile, is in the motorcade behind her husband with the prime minister, with his wife, who is sobbing hysterically. And the whole time she's holding this woman, she's comforting this woman, she's telling her it will be all right. She keeps calm, carries on, and they somehow miraculously are able to escape this mob. But they were very close to all of them being assassinated. So they come home and there's like a huge welcome from Eisenhower. This is a huge deal. And after that, I think Pat is very well known for her courage, and, just her calmness in the face of this utter chaos. And it just goes on from there. There are many other instances, but those two are really what come to mind first.
Well, and speaking of that trip, I don't think I had remembered truly her gift of diplomacy and how much international travel she did as a first lady. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, she went to over 80 countries during her time in office during both administrations, and then as second lady all over the world. Until Hillary Clinton, she was the most traveled first lady we have ever had. And she loved that. That was part of her job that she loved, with the caveat she hated leaving her two daughters at home. That was the thing that was always pulling her back. But she loved to travel. One of her ambitions as a young woman was to see the world, to get out of Artesia, the small town where she grew up, and to see the world. And she surely did that. She went to more places than most anyone even today ever goes. So that was part of her, something she really strived to do. But she also, along the way, became really a global diplomat, both with her husband as second lady, accompanying him all over the world on these team diplomacy trips. And then later, as first lady, she was the first lady to be a solo global ambassador, starting in Peru with the Great Peruvian earthquake in the early 70s, and then in Africa, going to Liberia and Ghana, all over Africa for important events. So, and she went by herself. Her husband said, "You are great at this. I want you to go and do this for me." And in Peru, people that interviews I found and interviews I did for the book, people said that Mrs. Nixon had done more for Peruvian diplomacy than anyone had ever done before, or for a long time after, anyone at a higher level, i.e. a president, had done. What she did, bringing relief supplies to earthquake-stricken Peru after that huge earthquake, that made all the difference. And she was awarded the Grand Cross, the Peruvian highest honor, for her relief work. And she was one of the first ladies to do that kind of relief work, humanitarian work. Eleanor Roosevelt had done some of that, but this was on a global scale. And really, Mrs. Nixon is the first to really do that in a big way.
More from a Reagan Forum featuring Heath Hardage Lee after this message.
The Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation is the nonprofit organization created by President Reagan himself, and specifically charged by him with continuing his legacy and sharing his principles: individual liberty, economic opportunity, global democracy, and national pride. We must remain vigilant and work together to share these conservative principles with younger generations. Your role is critical to move our mission forward. Thank you for your continued support. Please visit reaganfoundation.org/give. That's reaganfoundation.org/give.
Now back to a Reagan Forum featuring Heath Hardage Lee. So after reading your book, it was clear to me of the love story between Richard and Pat Nixon, and the true love they had for one another. But then on the same or on the other side of it, it was an interesting relationship. And like, for example, when they were waiting for the results to come in to see if he had won the presidency or not, he wanted to be alone. And Pat Nixon and the girls were in one room and he was in another room, and he wouldn't talk to them or look at them until the results came in. Can you talk about their sort of story together?
Oh, yes. And it's so complex and so interesting. And I think, like a lot of marriages, there are ups and downs. So, and in the beginning, though, one of the tropes is this idea that they had a loveless marriage. Completely untrue. And all you must do is read their courting letters and World War II letters, and they are passionately in love with each other. And Richard Nixon is super smitten with her. It takes her a little longer to get to that point. But then she also falls in love and they are both super committed. They are a very together couple. And I say not together at times in one of the chapter titles. And that's the complexity of the relationship. So he is very sequential, and he goes about winning like he goes about winning elections. He is hyper focused and is all over it. And then he moves on to the next thing. So then at times, I think he is so caught up in the politics of the moment, which is understandable. If you are running for president, you probably don't have time for candlelit dinners with your wife all the time, right? I mean, I think about people running right now on both sides. I mean, campaigns are brutal. I mean, you're living on the road, you're in and out of hotels. So, that becomes his life and her life too. And of course, she doesn't love it like he does. There's a push-pull there with what both halves of the couple want. And sometimes, she always is going to go support him and go along with it. But sometimes that does present conflicts. Now, what you were talking about, which I think is quite interesting, is the separate rooms at the, when the returns are coming in for the presidential election. I think he's also in some ways, very shy around Mrs. Nixon. He doesn't want to offend her. He puts her on a pedestal. So these expectations that he thinks she has of him make him a little bit like, oh gosh, I need to make sure I win first. It's a sort of an interesting approach to that. So it isn't what some people have interpreted it very critically, and I don't see it that way. I just think it's very different personalities and very private people also that did not like to display their affection in public. That was just not their generation. Remember, this is the Depression generation. I mean, they don't do PDA, public displays of affection. This is not how they roll. The same with the Kennedys, I might point out, Jack and Jackie Kennedy. They do not do that. That is not part of the deal at that time. In our internet, Instagram, era, everybody posts everything. And this is just not how it was in that time period. So,
yeah. What role, if any, do you think religion played in her life?
Okay, religion is a really intriguing question. She herself, and I found a very interesting quote from her about, she really lived by the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. She isn't particularly religious, I don't think. Now, they always went to church, and it was usually just wherever they were in Washington, what was close by. Richard Nixon, of course, was famously a Quaker from a Quaker family, had agreed to a Quaker ceremony when they got married, but she was I never found her particularly religious. And I say in the book too, I wonder if, again, this is speculation on my part, her mother dies so young of Bright's disease. Then her father dies. What she had seen by 17 did not lead her to believe in God or miracles. She believed in herself, and what could she do to pull herself up? So I think she was pioneer stock, frontier, DIY. I'm going to have to do this myself. I don't think that she necessarily, I'm not saying she didn't believe in God. I think she did, but I don't think she was counting on God to bail her out of any situation. She was very self-reliant. So I don't think religion was a definitive thing with her like it is with some other first ladies.
That's a fair answer. Now, you mentioned volunteerism earlier on. First ladies are always expected to pick a cause, whatever that cause might be, right? So for Mrs. Reagan, it was just say no to drugs or foster grandparents. And I think probably the two attached to Mrs. Nixon would have been volunteerism and right to read. So can you talk about her passion projects, her causes?
Yes, volunteerism, just those two you've cited, and many other charities she worked with also, as well as the Girl Scouts was one that came up quite a bit. Cystic fibrosis, she did so much with children. Also, the blind and the deaf, adapting facilities so that they could enjoy the facilities. And where she did this and did a lot, and also Julie and Tricia, her daughters, helped a lot with this in the White House for the White House tours. She made things accessible for the blind, the hearing impaired, and the disabled. I mean, way ahead of her time in that, ramps so that you could get into the White House in a wheelchair to tour. She even had tours where you could, now curators, and I'm a curator myself, would have a fit about this, but she would allow them to touch objects in the White House, or like curtains or things that curators would be like, please no, please don't do that. But the impulse was so good to allow them to feel things that they could not see. So I think that's something people have forgotten that she did that was a big deal at the time. And then also the White House Restoration and Renovation Program, started by Mrs. Kennedy. She, of course, started the White House Historical Association, wonderful idea and nonprofit association to preserve and protect the White House. But Jackie was only in there for 3 years, sadly, because of her husband's death. Mrs. Nixon comes in after the Johnsons, who really are a little wary of changing anything that the Kennedys have done. By the time the Nixons get there, the White House is really threadbare. It is really in need of a little uplift. Remember, there are just tens of thousands of people coming through the White House, so it is worn out by the time they get there. Mrs. Nixon acquires more objects and art for the White House than any first lady before or after her. It's over 600 objects, art, and antiques, as well as renovating, redoing the green room, the red room, the blue room. She does so much for that. And, people, again, in another sort of conflation, they think Jackie Kennedy did all of that. And of course, she deserves huge credit, Mrs. Kennedy, for starting this, but really it's Pat Nixon that takes that ball and moves forward with it.
Yeah. And I was actually going to ask you about that. Now, a little bit ago, we talked about all of her international travel, but what I probably should have led with is that she went with Richard Nixon to Vietnam, becoming the first lady to be in an active combat zone. Why did she go, and what was the reaction?
Yes, she went there. I don't think she thought too much about why should I go. She just thought I should go because they need to see me. These troops need to see me for morale, to set an example, all of these things. And as typical for Mrs. Nixon, we've talked about Caracas already, she is one of the bravest people in terms of physical bravery. I mean, this is a combat zone. Vietnam, and my previous book was about the Vietnam War. I have spent a lot of time writing about that period in our history, which was a very difficult period. And the war was just brutal. All these people just in horrible situations. And she doesn't hesitate to go over there and have, as First Lady, be the example. She is the commander-in-chief's spouse. She feels she needs to be there setting an example, but also talking to the soldiers, getting their stories, getting down on their level, taking letters back to their families. And it does so much for the morale of the country, not only our country, of course, primary objective, but also for our allies, the South Vietnamese, who say, we cannot believe that Mrs. Nixon would come over here, and that has done so much for our morale to show us that you are truly our allies. That has a huge impact. And that's another one about Mrs. Nixon that people don't realize. She was the first lady to go into a combat zone. So yeah. Pretty amazing.
So another lighthearted question, for people who know a lot about Ronald and Nancy Reagan, they'll know that their sort of non-presidential retreat was Rancho del Cielo, and the Nixons had their home in San Clemente. Can you talk about that home and what it meant to them?
Yes, Casa Pacifica, which was sort of their retreat, the Western White House retreat. And it's, a beautiful Spanish stucco mansion. And it gave them some privacy, some time away, but it was also a place where world leaders could come and, have this amazing experience on the western part of or the so-called Western White House. And I have a great picture in my book of the Nixons after the presidency in front of the house, and she's wearing this wonderful kind of Spanish inspired skirt. And it is, I think, again, this was where they are both Californians, and California is their home. This is where I think they are most themselves. They're both very Western influenced in the way they think about things. And they both loved that whole area. And when they were young, they would go to the beach kind of near there and sort of fantasize about living there and all these wonderful Spanish inspired towns and how they would love to live in this area. So it finally did come true when they were able to purchase that and spent so much time there.
Now, speaking about homes, and I know we touched about this briefly. In fact, you even talked about the People's House. Patricia Nixon preferred to refer to the presidential home not as the mansion, which it had sort of previously been looked at, but as the White House, the People's House, and President Reagan continued that sentiment, often calling the White House the People's House. Can you talk about her thoughts on the White House as a whole?
Yes, and I love that President Reagan continued that, because yes, it had been the mansion. It was sort of seen as more for elites and upper class, and it wasn't so much the people's house. And that's what Mrs. Nixon made a big point. I know her East Wing staff told me, they all said if anybody used the word the mansion, she would say, no, it's the people's house. And they learned very quickly it was for everybody. And again, going back to the Western roots, this hierarchy is anathema there. So she wants it to be open to everyone. Thus, also the tours for those with disabilities. This includes people who are blind or deaf or in wheelchairs, but everyday people. And she did say one time, and I think President Nixon got a little miffed about this, but she said, we're going to have everybody to the White House, not just the big shots. And, that's kind of, I think that's her mentality. She really felt more comfortable among kind of one-on-one. She could hang out with queens, princes, heads of state, but she felt that this was for the people, not just for the elites or, high-ranking officials. It was for everyone.
Now, of course, we can't talk about Mrs. Nixon and in your book as well. We can't talk about your book without obviously bringing up Watergate. How would you say that the Watergate situation as a whole impacted the relationship between President and Mrs. Nixon?
Yes, well, Watergate, one of their biggest trials, if not perhaps their biggest one politically, I think this did affect the relationship in that there was a small group, few men in particular, Bob Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, the president's close counselors, who I think formed a bit of a wall around him and tended to isolate him from his old friends, from his family, so that I believe Mrs. Nixon and the daughters often felt a little bit shut out from things. So one, I think they knew absolutely nothing of the extent of Watergate. Up until the end, they were all the two daughters, the sons-in-law, Mrs. Nixon, they were encouraging Richard Nixon to stay and fight. And even when the tapes came out, Mrs. Nixon said, you should burn the tapes. They are like love letters. They should not be shared with the public. They were all convinced that this was not something that should blow up into the big affair that it did. But I believe that they were starting, I would say, about in 1968. There was an old Nixon team before, of old hands, of old friends, of counselors. Of course, Mrs. Nixon, who was his best political counselor, I believe, and it was always the Pat and Dick team. And then 1968 on, she becomes sidelined, minimized by some of these men around the president, and they don't see her value. They don't use her as the public relations asset that she truly was. She was gold and should have been used. Now, she also didn't want to be used, so there was that too. But they didn't really appreciate when she did go out all the time and do these outward facing events and travel, global diplomacy. It was not appreciated or understood. So there is a bit of distance that is put between them during this period. And consequently, she really doesn't know what's going on to the extent that it was until everything blows up and it is almost the end. And then, of course, as we know, coming up next week is the 50th anniversary of the resignation, August 8th and 9th, when Nixon resigned. So, of course, Mrs. Nixon stood by him loyally, as did the girls, as did their husbands. And that was just a terrible, as you can imagine, upsetting event, televised for everyone to see. So very upsetting to all. And of course, it has to be discussed. And I do talk about Watergate in the book. But what I think that is contrary to a lot of popular belief, and David Eisenhower, the Nixon son-in-law, said this, and I think he's right. The narrative is that during Watergate, the Nixons were not speaking and they were very far apart in their relationship. And what David says and what I saw in some of the documents is there is a drawing even closer together between Pat and Richard Nixon. They are going to fight for him to stay in. And some of the staff that come back in after Haldeman and Ehrlichman are fired and Pat and the girls are more tapped in, they call it the last campaign. So they're trying to fight to save the presidency at that point. And I think they draw closer together then. And then later, when they are together in San Clemente, it's like their relationship comes full circle.
So, and that's really that was really going to be my next question. After the resignation, what does Mrs. Nixon do to sort of get the president sort of out of the slump that he is in and bring him back to a happy state?
Yes, and that part is such an interesting part of the story, I believe, because it's almost like a return to their early relationship where they're very, he's so smitten and pursuing her, and they have this very, World War II era romance. And then they're together. They're finally together in this beautiful villa that they've always wanted, not under the circumstances that they want. But over time, they become closer. He brings her flowers. He checks on her. He fluffs her pillows up. They eat together. They watch films that their Hollywood friends send to them to screen at the pool. They have dates with their friends, the Drowns, like double dates where the Drowns come over and play cards and have dinner with them. So she gets to garden. She gets to be with her friends. So she finally gets to what she calls a blessed aloneness, away from the press, to do the things that she wants to do and to be with her husband, her children, her grandchildren. And she even lets the dogs get on the sofa, which is a detail I should have put in the book and neglected to, but I believe it was maybe Julie that told me she didn't allow the dogs of course, in the White House to jump on the furniture. But finally at San Clemente, she gives up and she lets the dogs jump on the furniture and sit with them. And the dogs become a big part of their daily discussions. So it's back to when things are simpler. And I think they find a very happy period together towards the end of their lives after a series of health crises. Those, to back up, come first. Phlebitis for him. And then she has a stroke that it really is debilitating. But again, she is tough and she does the rehabilitation and gets back to her old self.
Now, in your book, you mention that she stayed on the Gallup's most admired women poll for 10 years in a row. Do you know how she felt about that? Do you know, are you aware that she was aware of that?
Oh, I know she was aware of it. And her husband, of course, he loved, I even have some film where he talks about it. I think that we might even see where he mentions that he was so proud. He was always telling people how she was always on the Gallup poll for 10 years. So I know she must have been aware of it. But again, with Mrs. Nixon or with Pat, she did not want credit. She did not, I can see her, she would have been like, oh, I don't want to talk about that. Like, she was not a type to toot her own horn or to really even care about that. That wasn't what she was after, but I know her family was incredibly proud of her. And to maintain your popularity intact after something like Watergate, and also for the public to be able to separate that, is pretty remarkable, I think. So it really,
absolutely.
it's a testament to how people saw her as a person.
Yeah, agreed. My final question. So in the book, you actually mention the opening of the Nixon library. Now, President Reagan was there. I'm going to read this card. And at the opening, President Reagan called Mrs. Nixon a true unsung hero of the Nixon administration. Then when she passes away in 93, and I will give thanks to you because you shared this letter with us that we will now put up on screen, but President Reagan wrote a handwritten condolence letter to President Nixon. And in that condolence letter, which people should be seeing on the screen now, it says, "Nancy and I fondly remember the many happy times we spent with you both, and like the rest of America, we will greatly miss her." So as we wrap up this virtual conversation, what would you say is Mrs. Nixon's greatest legacy?
Oh gosh, there's so many legacies she has, but I would really have to narrow it down to three. So she would tell you, and I know this was her what she thought her biggest legacy was personally were her two daughters, Julie and Tricia. So that would be her number one legacy. I think she and President Nixon, I know, would agree on that. But the other two that were more concerned with her time as First Lady, one, her international diplomacy, which we've talked a lot about, her ability to have the one-on-one, behind-the-scenes soft diplomacy that would help her husband seal the deal. Russia and China are two where it was incredibly important that she be the face of the Nixon administration while her husband was behind closed doors negotiating. So there's a lot in the book about what she did behind the scenes with, say, the wives of world leaders to cultivate this peace and diplomacy for all. So I think that is amazing. And her global solo ambassador position was a first, and extremely important that she did that on her own. And then the other equally important legacy would be what she did for women behind the scenes. We've talked about this, the ERA, pro-choice, was very progressive kind of background, the push to get a woman on the Supreme Court, the push through Barbara Hackman Franklin, the president's special assistant, to get women in higher levels of government. These are all super important and things people really don't know and don't associate particularly with Mrs. Nixon. She was not a feminist, but pro-women in a major way. And the seeds of this we see with the Supreme Court. She plants those seeds. And then under the Reagan administration, we get Sandra Day O'Connor. So sometimes, these things take time. And she would get, maybe push back for, what are you doing for women? She was doing it, but it was behind the scenes and it took time. And now, we've seen those results. So I would say for women, her legacy pushing for women is her other most important legacy as First Lady.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure speaking with you. I want to remind everyone who's watching this that The Mysterious Mrs. Nixon is for sale, and you can, of course, buy it anywhere, including the Reagan Library gift store. And thank you for joining us. Thank you for writing this book, and we look forward to seeing what is next with you.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Signed copies of The Mysterious Mrs. Nixon can be purchased through the Reagan Library Museum Store. Every purchase you make from our catalog, website, or museum store is a critical component to our success. In short, your purchase supports our efforts to extend the legacy of President Ronald Reagan. Purchases can be made at reaganlibrary.com/store. To find a listing of all upcoming events, please visit reaganfoundation.org/events. Thank you for listening. For more information on the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, including information on how to become a member, information on upcoming exhibits at the Reagan Library, and more information on the legacy of President Reagan, please visit reaganfoundation.org. And don't forget to like and follow the Reagan Foundation on all social media platforms.
Until next week, thanks for listening. God bless you.
Don't forget to subscribe to A Reagan Forum podcast in your iTunes or Google Play stores, and on other podcast platforms as they become available. New episodes of A Reagan Forum come out every Thursday. Like what you hear? Check out our Words to Live By podcast, featuring radio addresses and speeches Ronald Reagan delivered from the 1960s through the 1980s. New episodes drop every Tuesday. And don't forget to follow @Ronald Reagan on Facebook, @Ronald Reagan on Twitter, and Reagan Foundation on YouTube. Also, search for us on SoundCloud and Stitcher.